Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming back to our second session of our course, Christian Nationalism Undefined. As I previewed in our previous session, tonight we're going to be thinking about this terminological and definitional question, right? The theme of our course is the challenge of defining things and maybe even sometimes the problems with defining things. And so we're going to be thinking about this question of frequently you'll hear language of white Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism. And sometimes those are interchangeable. Sometimes people feel very strongly that you should choose one or the other of those. And so we're going to wrestle with those and think about the different aspects, the different sides of that argument tonight. And I'll try to make clear why I think it's really important as we go along. So if you go ahead, and I'm going to go, some of you who came on early already saw this, but we are using a system called Slido to help with our Q&A, and we're also going to be doing a couple surveys tonight. So please either use your phone to scan in that QR code, or you can just open up a browser window and put in this 7-digit code, and that will enter you into the Slido system for this meeting. It's all anonymous. You don't have to log in or anything. And if you have questions that come up over the course of our conversation, feel free to just put those in Slido. And there's a Q&A section in there. And if you are looking at that and you're like, oh, that person asked the question that I really wanted to ask, you can upvote it. And so it'll drive it up to the top of the list. So it's clear that, oh, other people are also interested in this question. And as we go along, we'll also come to a couple of little survey questions. In fact, one will be in just a minute, where we're going to get some audience feedback from you all. So let's get going. So we tonight are again thinking about this question of white Christian nationalism versus Christian nationalism, and which one is to be preferred. And this is a debate that is playing out among experts, among scholars, among journalists, and among people. And so these are four very prominent books that have come out in the last few years about Christian nationalism. Bradley Onishi, good friend and colleague of mine, wrote a book called Preparing for War. If you're really interested in Brad's book, we did a book event with him about a year ago. You can find it on our YouTube channel. The Phil Gorski and Sam Perry, also friends of mine, have written this book, The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and a Threat to American Democracy. Also, a couple other folks who I consider colleagues and friends. Catherine Stewart has written this very important book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of, and note she says religious nationalism, not even just Christian nationalism, religious nationalism. So the book is about Christian nationalism or Christianity in America, but she says religious nationalism. And then Paul Miller, who is a professor at Georgetown and a former White House staffer, I believe he worked in the Bush administration, has written a book called The Religion of American Greatness: What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism? And I can say, as somebody who is I also just clipped the headline from this Substack post by Jamar Tisby, that this was literally last week. He put out the Substack post, "The White in White Christian Nationalism. Remember to say the white part out loud." Right. So we're thinking. We talked last week about history and the way that history and the history of the United States has really shaped the conversation we have today around Christian nationalism, but it has also raised these questions over and over and over again in different eras of American history. And so, as you can see, some of these authors are choosing to really lean into and talk about race and whiteness as a dimension or a major dimension of Christian nationalism, and others are choosing not to. And so we want to think about that and think about what is at stake in these two choices. So what we're going to do, if you've got your Slido deck ready, we're going to have I want to get your impressions. So first, let me outline kind of where we're going to go, and then we're going to have our own little survey conversation. So we're going to start out by thinking about what is the history of interlinking whiteness and Christianity in the United States. How has that played out in American history? So we'll start out again with a little bit of history. Well, we're also going to look at how the two sides in this debate of using terminology of Christian nationalism versus white Christian nationalism, how do they frame their positions? How do they think about this question? And what are the best arguments that they have? We're going to think a little bit about this, whether this debate even matters. And I am going to argue that yes, it does matter. In fact, I think that potentially the 2024 election could hinge on how we think about this question and how it plays out in our society. So pause for that. We're going to look at also, we're going to do some deep dive into the data and what are the actual racial and ethnic demographics of Christian nationalism in the US. And you'll get a chance to even take the survey and see where you come out as a Christian nationalist or not. And then last, we'll try to kind of consider it towards the end tonight. Is there a better way forward in this debate? Is this debate intractable? Are we just stuck with this debate? Or are there maybe some other ways to think about this, other ways to approach the question that might get us through kind of the quandary of whether to have this adjective white attached to Christian nationalism all the time? All right, so let's get your impressions here. So again, if you have not already logged into Slido, you can use this QR code up in the corner, or you can just open a browser window and go to slido.com and enter this 7-digit code. But I want you to try to answer the question. You can write as much as you want, but we only have a few minutes, so don't write an essay. But what is the difference in your hearing, the difference in connotation from your hearing between saying Christian nationalism, and you can, if you want to be brief, you can just abbreviate that CN, and saying white Christian nationalism, or WCN. So when you hear those two phrases, how do they strike you differently? And what different impression do they give you? And you'll even be able to see some of your co-participants' answers popping up on the screen as you answer the question. All right, I know some of you are still typing here, but I'm gonna read some of these just to give us a feel for how different people are struck by these two phrases. So somebody said there is no difference; it's the same exact thing. Other people are focusing in on kind of racism. Some people are weighing in on which one is better. We'll see kind of where you stand at the end of tonight. So there's an impression of extremism associated with white Christian nationalism that I don't consider as strongly in just Christian nationalism. WCN sounds more exclusive, maybe encompassing racism, power-seeking impulse with the white Christian nationalism. When you add the white in, it links into white supremacy. Better recognize the historical roots of the power structures undergirding the movement we see today. That there's a racism at the heart of Christian nationalism. Saying white assumes that Christians of color may be homogeneous in their view on Christian nationalism. Interesting. So that seems to be a little bit more skeptical, perhaps, of this white Christian nationalism title. Another person weighing in that WCN is more accurate in describing the phenomenon because it is blending together race and religion. WCN acknowledges the primacy of white males in their value system. Interesting that somebody has introduced gender into this as well, which is not intrinsic in either of these terminologies. WCN makes me think of the KKK. WCN is more narrow. I don't need to differentiate between the two. I'm firmly convinced that CN has racism at its core. And to be clear, I'm not being flippant. White focuses race into the conversation. There is something unique about adding white to the Christian nationalism, and that is supremacy. Adding the word white adds another layer of privilege and power. WCN is narrower and possibly more dangerous, okay? WCN is more historical. WCN references imperialism and colonialism. It's vital. Whites are terrified of being replaced. Christian nationalism has no racial component. WCN foregrounds race. All right. We got a link to Civil War, Jim Crow. Okay. Well, you all have pretty much replicated the debate in your comments here. This is the quandary that we find ourselves in, is that for many analysts, race is essential. Race is core to understanding the phenomenon of Christian nationalism. Others have called that somewhat into question. And so I want to grapple with both of those positions tonight and think about both of the ways that people position race in relationship, especially whiteness, in relationship to Christian nationalism, and what are some of the ways that people raise questions about that? Okay. First, though, let's do some history. So we are back on a timeline here of American history, and let me just say, we are going to cover this very briefly. I could easily spend a 3-week course just on this question of the history of whiteness and Christianity in the United States. We may well do a course on that someday, but this is not that course. So we're gonna spend maybe 10 minutes on this history, and then we'll move into some of the survey data. Again, not because the history is unimportant, but because this is a course on the definitions of Christian nationalism, and we're going to try to stick to that theme. So when we're thinking about history of race and Christian nationalism, there are a lot of people who want to start at the end of the story, and they'll say, well, the civil rights movement, right? The civil rights movement in the 1950s, 1960s, that really kind of brought this stuff to the foreground. And some people would even say, well, that dealt with question of whiteness and white privilege and white power in America. I think that's a really bad way to do history, because that is in many ways a fait accompli kind of approach to American history that wants to say, well, sure, there were some tensions, some issues earlier on, but then we resolved those, and they quote MLK and feel like we're past things. That is a trivialization, I would argue, of the realities of American history. So I want to go through some of those realities and think about how they are still impacting us today. So this is something that has come much more to the fore in our conversation in the last couple of years. There have been several interesting books on this. But if you all remember your elementary school rhyme, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, in 1493, the Pope created the doctrine of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery, it was part of a papal edict. And the basic idea of the doctrine of discovery was that European Christian explorers, when they encountered a new place, when they encountered a new people, a new land, if those people were not Christian, the Christian explorers had the right to claim it. And you can just imagine how this idea plays out in the history of the New World, right? And this is not coincidental that this is coming down in 1493, right? Because news has just reached Europe of this vast new land across the ocean between Europe and the East Indies, and they are really kind of thinking, well, how do we think about this new space? And this doctrine of discovery actually gets referenced by the U.S. Supreme Court. I believe it's 1823, gets referenced in a U.S. Supreme Court decision as a sort of undergirding, a justification for American expansion into these new territories, and for the American government as it expands westward to displace Native peoples, right? So in a certain sense, the doctrine of discovery is a Catholic question, right? It's coming from the Pope, and so it's not normative for Protestants necessarily, but it is an important pillar of this kind of expansion of white Europeans into the New World and laying claim to the lands and the possessions and the lives of Native peoples, right? And so that is also an element, and this is something that has been there from 1493. I mean, it's only within the last 20 or 30 years you've had disavowals of this by the Roman Catholic Church and apologies over this. One of those apologies even happened, I believe, last year. So this is still a current issue in many ways that people are still wrestling with and thinking about. Of course, one of the first settlements in the New World, at least the European settlements, was in Jamestown, the colony of Jamestown, that's founded in 1607. And as some of you may know from the New York Times reporting, just a few years later, in 1619, the first enslaved persons are brought to North America in present-day Hampton, Virginia, just north of Jamestown there, right? So here we are at the very earliest foundations of what we think of today as America or the United States. Slavery is being integrated in and brought in as a dimension, and racialized slavery. Now, there's some debate among historians and theorists about whether race and racial conceptions predate slavery, or whether slavery and this condition of owning slaves and seeking to justify that is in some ways creates or engenders the conversation and race that we have today. So most people recognize that these are absolutely interrelated. How we think about race in the modern world and how slavery, especially African slavery, plays out is these things are twinned together. And sometimes, but there's a little bit of a chicken and egg conversation. Is it that race is creating slavery, or is slavery creating race? And I think there are, again, good arguments on both sides of that historical debate. But from the start, and this is very important to note, American slavery was theologically justified by Christians. It was not something that was happening on the side that was entirely detached from Christian theology. In fact, Christian theologians were key participants in the creation of this modern category of race, the ways we think about race, and they were using biblical interpretation to describe and instantiate this racial regime, this regime of enslavement that was obviously more practiced in the American South, but was definitely present in the North and had strong implications for life in the North. So we sometimes use our kind of Civil War lens to think about that slavery is really a kind of North versus South thing. But no, the Northern communities and institutions were also deeply implicated and often participating in the enslavement of people, and using theology again to do that. In fact, I was attending a church in Baltimore where we traced back the history of the founding of the church, and you could see that the people who had endowed and founded the church had, even though they were not slave owners, they were cotton merchants in Baltimore, just 20 miles or so south of the Mason-Dixon line, and they had held slaves as a sort of financial tool at different points as they were adjudicating debts that different people had, right? So these ties to slavery are very deep and connected throughout the United States, especially the East Coast here. Of course, in 1776, we have the Declaration of Independence and these famous and immortal words of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, a principle, a value that we still aspire to in many ways. But many of the same people who signed that declaration just about 11 years later are compromising and having a debate about not should we count African Americans as citizens. That was not even on the table. That was nowhere on the table. It was not a debate about whether women should be allowed to vote. That was never on the table. It was a question of, in the South, in slave-holding states, how do you count the slaves as part of the population? And so what is worked out is what's called the 3/5 compromise. I'm sure many of you remember this from your history classes, that slaves count as 3/5 of a person for the sake of allocating representatives. Not that those people ever get to vote, but they are counted as 3/5 of a person for the sake of allocating representatives, right? So it's almost a double dehumanization of African Americans, that not only do they not count as citizens, but they only count as 3/5 of a person for the sake of the U.S. Census and the allocation of representatives at the national level. So there is a contradiction there, I would say, between the virtues and the values of our founding and the enactment of our founding. Shortly after the founding of the United States, there were a number of African Americans, some of them enslaved, some of them not, who became Christians. Many of them became Protestants, right? And sometimes this was an intentional thing on the part of slaveholders to Christianize their slaves, to try to get them to become Christians. but there was also a suspicion, a worry about Christianizing slaves for some slaveholders, because there were certain parts of the Bible they didn't want them reading, right? The Exodus story is not a great narrative for you to hold if you're an enslaver, right? For you to advocate for this story of the liberation of the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt. That's not really a story that you want to emphasize if your hermeneutic is about justifying slavery. And so what happens in many churches when Black Christians, whether enslaved or free, try to join those churches, they are treated as second-class Christians. Black men are not allowed to be ordained in white denominations. Black Christians need to sit at the back of the church if they're allowed in the church at all. And so this leads to the formation of what we think of today as the Black church. Black Protestants are forced to start their own churches and start their own denominations in order to have Black men be able to be ordained. And so many of the historically Black churches, the historically Black denominations, have their roots in this antebellum period, the lead up to the Civil War, where Black Christians are claiming their own dignity and saying, I don't see anything in the Bible that says I'm a second-class Christian and I have dignity. And in order, they could not find equality in white denominations and white churches, and so they had to go and create their own, right? Now, if we fast forward through that history, it is those same denominations and communities that give rise to the civil rights movement, right? So there's a certain irony, certain poetry about the dignity that is claimed in this antebellum period by African-American Christians culminates in many ways in the civil rights movement and this broader claim to dignity in society, right? And so there's a beauty in that, but that there was 170 odd years of oppression and dehumanization that also accompanied that, and we can't forget that. We can't ignore that. As things start ramping up towards the Civil War, as you start to have this polarization that we talked about last week, of course, there's a growth in Christian piety in the lead up to the Civil War through the Second Great Awakening, but there's also real divides, theological divides, political divides, economic divides between the North and the South, and most of the major Protestant denominations in the United States fractured between North and South. So before you might have had the Methodist Church, well, it split into the Northern Methodist Church and the Southern Methodist Church. Where you had the Presbyterian denomination, it splits into the Northern Presbyterian and the Southern Presbyterian denominations. The Baptists split into the Northern Baptists and the Southern Baptists. Some of those fractures are healed over time, are reconciled over time. And this is why sometimes you'll see the word united in denominations titles, United Methodists, right? The United Baptists, right? There's a reunification, a coming together. Sometimes it was well into the 20th century before that happened. The Southern Baptists never reunited, right? The Southern Baptist Church split from the Northern Baptist Church over slavery. It's still the Southern Baptist Church. That's why it's called that, is because it split from the Northern Baptists over this the claimed right by Southern Baptist leaders to enslave people. That was the divide that led to the formation of the Southern Baptist Church. There's been some attempts to apologize for that by the Southern Baptists, but it has not. There's not been a reconciliation per se or reunification between the Northern and Southern Baptists. After the Civil War, right, you don't really have nearly as much slavery being justified. If you're very interested in kind of where some of these theological enslavers went, many of them actually moved to Brazil because slavery was still legal in Brazil, and brought Jim Crow values. My friend João Chavez has a great book on the Jim Crow leaders who went into Brazil and brought their version of Southern Christianity, enslaving Christianity, into Brazil. But in the US, of course, you have the system of Jim Crow that gets set up in the South, and that also is theologically justified. It was not merely, this is a political arrangement. People were using Christian theology, using Christian Bible interpretation to do that. It's also during this period that we have the first KKK. In this period of Reconstruction, the first KKK emerges. You might not know this, but there's actually been 3 different KKKs in history. So the first KKK is very much about resisting the North, resisting the Reconstruction of the South, and resisting the amendments that are made to the Constitution. But that effort kind of dies out over time. And then the second KKK gets started in the 20th century. And the second KKK, I have an image here. This is from, I think it's 1926, where these KKK leaders are marching. And you know what the building in the background? That's U.S. Capitol. Right. So when we think about the Capitol riot on January 6, 2021, and we'll deal more with the Capitol riot next week, that is the Capitol has been a symbol that has often been used as a form of protest in favor of those in power, and has often been laid claim to by those seeking to lay claim to American cultural history. And then right now, we are still living through the era of the third KKK that really got started in the 1950s, that is still an ongoing organization. And interestingly, these KKKs, these different eras, these different instantiations of the KKK carry with them different prejudices. So the first KKK was very interested in resisting Reconstruction. The second KKK also was anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish, right? Because you'd had a wave of Catholic and Jewish immigration at the end of the 19th century. And so, yes, it was Christian nationalism, but it was also white Protestant nationalism that was driving the second KKK. The third KKK that we have now is much more kind of strictly just racist in its orientation, right? So that, when we talk about the civil rights movement, what is the civil rights movement addressing? It is a messy and ugly history of American Christianity blending whiteness with Christianity in extremely toxic ways, and in ways that justify the enslavement of African Americans, justify the massacring of Native Americans, justify Christians and white Christians as at the top of the pile in American life. So to sum up, look at these two charts. This is these both come from the Public Religion Research Institute. The one on the top in red is from 2015, and these are the states where white Christians remain a dominant portion of the population. Right, the darker red they are, those are over 60% white Christian. Right, and then the lighter is around 51 to 60%, and then the different shades of gray are under 50%. And then look, this was just published today, came also from the Public Religion Research Institute. The share who say they adhere to or sympathize with Christian nationalism, and we'll talk about what adhere to and sympathize mean in a little bit, but basically support for Christian nationalism. And look at the states that are over 40% of the U.S. of the statewide population supporting Christian nationalism, according to PRRI's most recent survey. There's a lot of overlap between those two maps. Right, so that's not white Christian nationalism. They're not asking white Christian nationalism in the survey. They're just asking Christian nationalism. So there is correlation between a state having a strong majority white Christian population and a state leaning towards this Christian nationalism. Right, they're still linked, and I would argue that it is impossible today to think about American religion without also thinking about race. Because white Christians' racism and segregationist impulses forged that connection. And it is a deep connection, right? Martin Luther King used to talk about that Sunday morning at 11 a.m. is the most segregated hour in America. Many studies have shown that's more or less still true. Right? And we are still a deeply racially segregated form of Christianity in the United States. We also need to pay attention to, though, the fact that whiteness is not a stable category in American history. Right, it started out meaning roughly Anglo-Protestant, right, in the founding era, and really up through the Civil War, more or less. This white meant Anglo-Protestant, or at least Northern European. But then, as you have more and more Catholics immigrating from Eastern Europe and from Southern Europe and from Ireland, and as you have Jews of European descent immigrating at the end of the 19th century, there is, yes, whiteness is deployed as a weapon against Italian and Polish and Irish Catholics, and against Eastern European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews. But then over time, there's also, and we looked at this a little bit last week, there's more and more inclusion, right? The interfaith, maybe we should put that in quotes, the interfaith movement of the 1930s was trying to integrate in Catholics and Jews and as a sort of solidarity against fascism. But then in the Cold War, that becomes the Judeo-Christian America that gets to exclude everyone else and is against the godless communists, right? So race is complicated. Whiteness is complicated. It shifts, it moves. People try to claim whiteness as a part of their integration into American society, again, because the Anglo-Protestants made that the criteria in many respects for being American. They want to say white is normative, white is privileged, and so other people aspire to whiteness and try to integrate into this system forged by these Anglo-Protestants. And the foundation of today's American Christian nationalism were laid by white Christians maintaining their privileges and imagining their uniqueness. That's where we get this history and this legacy of Christian nationalism. And if you doubt that, please go back and watch the video from last week, because I think that's pretty evident even from there. So we come to what are the arguments on the two sides? How do different people think about this? So here's this quote from Jemar Tisby. This is actually from that Substack piece that I showed the title of earlier. He says, this is at the bottom, race is a central element in white Christian nationalism, and it speaks to the kind of social structure they want to create, namely one with white moneyed men at the top and all others in degrees of subordinate roles. And look at this history, right? White American Christianity built the structures and scaffolding of Christian nationalism. And so people who say you need to say the white, like Jemar Tisby, are saying, how do you read this history and not see the way that whiteness has been central to the way that Christian nationalism gets deployed? And while not all Americans and folks who advocate for this position will acknowledge, not all Christian nationalists in America are white. They would say, while not all of the Americans who participate in Christian nationalism today are white, white Christian dominance, and this is a phrase that comes from Gorski and Perry's book, is the deep story of American Christian nationalism. Right? It's the undercurrent. It's built in. And then surveys, and we saw this in the map, surveys show that there's a strong correlation between views upholding whiteness and views upholding Christian nationalism. Right, so you can correlate these things in surveys. So one of the major surveys comes in this book, Taking America Back for God, that came out in 2020 by Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry. And this is a quote from that book. Christian nationalism is fundamentally about preserving or returning to a mythic society in which traditional hierarchical relationships, e.g. between men and women, between whites and blacks, are upheld, and authority structures are biblical and just. Right? So it's kind of how, at least and Whitehead and Perry are both sociologists. They are using survey data. This is the entire book is built around survey data about people's answers on these surveys about Christian nationalism and race. And they're saying there's a very strong correlation, and it's about, and that correlation links into this idea of an authority structure in Christian nationalism, and that often gets overlaid also with whiteness. Okay, so that's the case for having an understanding of Christian nationalism that integrates whiteness as central and definitional to Christian nationalism. So on the other side, for folks who argue for just Christian nationalism language, they would say, well, while the majority of Christian nationalists, like the majority of all Americans, are white, the language and rhetoric that is used in these Christian nationalist circles is rarely overtly racist, and it's often intentionally ethnically inclusive, right? Christian nationalists in America today rarely overtly invoke race. And in fact, they try to be racially inclusive in the way that they talk about things. And so is it fair to call them all white Christian nationalists? Another argument that gets made is, well, Christian nationalism is a global phenomenon, right? And so labeling it white Christian nationalism is imposing a very American lens on a broader movement or tendency, right? Because there's Christian nationalism in Ghana, there's Christian nationalism in Brazil, there's Christian nationalism in Poland, there's Christian nationalism in Hungary. Is all of that white Christian nationalism? Or do we only use the white Christian nationalism title in America, in the United States? right? There's a kind of taxonomic question, right? If you remember your taxonomy in doing biology, that how are you ordering your categories? How are you thinking about your categories when you say that this is white? Because there's a lot of forms of Christian nationalism that are not related to American whiteness. So should we say white American Christian nationalism, right? And yes, American Christian nationalism is deeply bound up with race, and people who advocate for using Christian nationalism will fully acknowledge that. But they say, but what about all the non-white people who also participate in Christian nationalism? Are they inherently racist or bought into white supremacy? Right? One of the people I study and write about in my book is a Korean American pastor whose family immigrated from North Korea when he was a child. And he spoke on January 5th at the rally that was kind of intended to ramp people up for January 6th, and gave an extremely Christian nationalist message there. His name is Che-on. He leads a multi-ethnic, predominantly Asian megachurch in Pasadena, California. Che-on, in his January 5th speech to a group of Christian nationalists gathering right before the Capitol riot, invokes his immigrant experience and says, we're not living in a communist country. My family came from a communist country. I know what that's about. We are not in a communist country. We're in America, right? So is Che-on participating in white supremacy in that moment? Or is there something more complicated going on in that moment? And is whiteness attached to him, even as a Korean immigrant, right? These are the questions that folks ask who are saying, well, maybe you don't need the white in there. So Ann Nelson has written this great book called Shadow Network that I definitely recommend. That's about the way that media and money have created these networks that are not entirely visible to the public, that have really kind of created the radical Christian right. But in there, she has this interesting observation where she says, when I told friends I attended services at charismatic and fundamentalist churches, again, she's writing about Christian nationalism in this book, the reaction was often, they're all a bunch of racists. But then Ann Nelson says, I found that some of the most racially integrated spaces I've experienced have been in non-denominational megachurches, whether in Oklahoma or Times Square. That doesn't sound like white Christian nationalism. If these are highly racially integrated megachurches that are also part of these networks of Christian supremacy or Christian nationalism, that doesn't sound like a system where whiteness is at the core of the conception of Christian nationalism. So what's going on there? This is a little headline here from the New Republic. Catherine Stewart, who's the one who wrote the book The Power Worshippers that I showed earlier, wrote this piece. This was from 2022. Where she says the Democratic Party is shedding Latino voters, and here's why. And part of what she traces out in that article, which again I'd recommend you go and read, is that the Republican Party was making great inroads with Latino voters, right? Often through networks of Christians and churches. So in conventional terminology, we would call that Christian nationalism. A lot of what they're talking about in those churches is Christian nationalism. But these are Latino churches. They're often bilingual churches. So what's going on there? Is that a part of white Christian nationalism, or is that something else? How do we think about those two things together? Okay. Let me, if you got to the point where you're like, oh my goodness, you egghead academics with your terminological conversations, I'm so tired of you guys just doing your debates over terminology. Let me tell you why it matters. Most white Christians in America, not white Christian nationalists, not white evangelicals, most white Christians in America, not to mention a huge majority of white Christian nationalists, have aligned solidly around Donald Trump in both 2016 and 2020. And this included white mainland Protestants and white Catholics. In fact, Donald Trump won a majority of the white mainline Protestant and the white Catholic vote in 2016. And he won the majority of white mainline Protestants in 2020. And he almost got a majority of white Catholics. The only thing that prevented, apparently, white Catholics from fully supporting Donald Trump in 2020 was the fact that Joe Biden was Catholic, a white Catholic. And so I think it was something like around 47% of white Catholics voted for Donald Trump in 2020. Right? That's a lot. That's a lot of Catholics, white Catholics voting for Donald Trump, right? So this is not exclusively an evangelical phenomenon. In fact, this is actually a headline from Pew Research Center. Most white Americans who regularly attend worship services voted for Trump in 2020. Right? So, and it's also not they're not real Christians. Right? These are the people who go to church, are the people voting for Trump. Most religiously unaffiliated and people of other religions voted for Democrats in both elections. Right? So we have this polarization that we're seeing in American society. So the Christianity Today ran a survey actually in 2018, but it was about the 2016 election. They were trying to look back at 2016, and they looked at how evangelicals voted for Trump. And what they found was about 77% of white evangelicals in 2018 said, yeah, I voted for Trump. Only 9% of Black evangelicals said they voted for Trump, but 41% of Hispanic evangelicals said they voted for Trump. This is in 2016. And 48% of other ethnicities of evangelicals said they voted for Trump in 2016. So are those 41% of Hispanic evangelicals and 48% of evangelicals of other ethnicities white Christian nationalists? Are they part of white Christian nationalism? Well, that's a big question. Christians of color today make up about 25% of the US population. And just to put that in perspective, we're at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, right? About 1.5% of the US population is Muslim. Around 2% of the US population is Jewish. There are 12 times as many Christians of color in the United States as there are Jews or Muslims. So Christians of color are a huge segment of the voting population, and many of them are swing voters because their cultural affinities, right? If they're identifying more by their racial or ethnic group or communities, they might lean more towards Democrats, right? That's what we've seen in the survey data. But their religious affinities seem to lean more towards Republican. So you have right at the center of our politics, right in the middle of this very divided populace, are Christians of color. This is we'll look more at the survey in a little bit, but this comes from PRRI. So the blue are white Christians. The pinkish, purplish is people who don't identify at all with a religion. The orange shades are people of religions that are not Christianity. And the green are Christians of color, right? So about 25% of the population. So I really think that the outcome of the 2024 election could very well hinge on the degree to which American Christians of color are embracing Christian nationalism. Because Christian nationalism drags people towards the Republican Party. And I can't find anyone who's paying attention to that or closely measuring it because it doesn't fit our categories. So we're having a conversation about white Christian nationalism. People aren't talking about Latino Christian nationalism. People aren't talking about Black Christian nationalism, right? Do those things even exist? Are they real? We don't actually have very good data on that. So I want to try to dive into some of that data and think about what are the actual racial and ethnic demographics of American Christian nationalism today, and has Christian nationalism made inroads among non-white Christians, as we seem to see in some of these indications. Okay, so we're going to be looking at a survey that was conducted. This was done in the late fall, early winter of 2022 by the Public Religion Research Institute and the Brookings Institution. It's been one of the biggest studies we've had to date on Christian nationalism. Very, very important survey. I have been on 2 academic panels about this survey. I've spent a lot of time talking about it. They interviewed about 6,000 adult respondents coming from all 50 states. And based on their responses, they sorted people into these 4 categories. They're either Christian nationalism adherents, as in they really endorse Christian nationalism sympathizers, people who might be kind of interested in it but not fully on board, Christian nationalism skeptics, people who are not completely rejecting it, but are kind of looking at it a little more skeptically, and then rejectors. So we're going to take the survey. I'm going to have you take the survey. So get a pen or paper, get out the note little app on your phone or on your computer. You're going to need to do a very little bit of math. So you might want to pull up a calculator, or maybe you're a math genius and you don't need it. Okay, so we're gonna take the survey here. There's going to be 5 questions. On each of these questions, you need to pick one of these 4 options: completely disagree, mostly disagree, mostly agree, or completely agree. Okay, for each of these, it's going to be a statement. You need to choose one of those 4 options. Okay, here's question A. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. So just write A, and then which of these 4 options? Completely agree, mostly disagree, completely disagree. Okay, question 2. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. Question 4. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Statement 4. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. And lastly, statement 5. God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Okay, so you should have 5 answers that are all picking from these either completely disagree, mostly agree, or completely agree. Okay, everyone got it? All right, now we're going to convert those into numbers. So on every question, if you answered completely disagree, just give yourself a 0. Okay, if you did mostly disagree on any question, give yourself a 0.33. If you answered mostly agree, give yourself a 0.67. And if you answered completely agree, give yourself a 1. So what you're going to do is add all of those together. So you should have a number somewhere between 0 and 5, and then divide that number by 5. And that's your score. And it won't mean anything to you at this moment, but I'm going to give you a second to calculate your score. Again, total up. So figure for each question, what was your answer? You should have 5 numbers, add them together, and then divide by 5. You can use your calculator if you need to. This is an open calculator exam. All right. Hopefully all of you have a score. Your score should be somewhere between 0 and 1, or it could include 0 and 1. Okay. All right. Here's how those scores play out in the PRRI survey. If you are at 0, you are a Christian nationalism rejector. If you answered 0 on all of the questions, you are a rejector of Christian nationalism. Okay. If you answered anywhere between 0.01, if your score is anywhere between 0.01 and 0.49, so anywhere shy of 0.5, basically, you're a Christian nationalism skeptic. If your answer was anywhere between 0.5 and 0.74, you are counted by PRRI as a Christian nationalism sympathizer. And if your score was between 0.75 and 1, you would be considered a Christian nationalism adherent. Okay? So now you should be able to locate yourself. You have a score, figure out which color you are. Are you kind of a greenish blue, green, orange, or pink? All right. And now we're going to do another survey to figure out how our class ranks according to the PRRI scale. Okay. So go back into your Slido and you can choose, this is anonymous, but just tell us, where did you land in the survey? Which one of these categories fit you? With 43 participants so far, it's looking like our participant group is somewhere between is entirely, we have 2% of our respondents came out in the sympathizers category. 40% came out as skeptics, no adherents, to Christian nationalism in our sample size here, and 58% rejectors. So it means more than half of you got answered completely disagree on all of these questions. Let me just say, and this probably shouldn't surprise anyone here, that our class is not representative of the American population. The people who signed up for a course at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies and Christian Nationalism is not representative of the US population. Let me show you where there is the Christian nationalism spectrum lands according to PRRI in the whole population. So this is, again, this is from their data from their 2023 study. 10% of the US population came out adherents, meaning they answered somewhere from agree to strongly agree on basically all 5 of those questions. 19% came out sympathizers. So they were, again, between like 0.5 and 0.75 on that scale. 39%, the largest share, came out skeptics. So that means they answered somewhere from mostly disagree to agree on some question, right? And then 29% of the US population come out as rejectors. Okay, so that's the breakdown. Now let's think about race in this question. How does this play out among as we layer in race into this conversation, into these factors? So, and you can find this report if you wanted to read through this report. It's just search PRRI Christian nationalism, and you can read the entire PDF of this report. It's all available online. So what they found was that white evangelical Protestants, this again will probably not shock anyone necessarily, that white evangelical Protestants would be the most sympathetic to Christian nationalism, but they found that 29% of white evangelical Protestants are adherents. 35% are sympathizers. There are some people who got no score. I think they kind of skipped the questions on the survey. And then 30% skeptics, and only 3% of white evangelical Protestants are rejectors. Basically, they answered no, absolutely no on all questions. So that means almost 2/3 of white evangelicals are either adherents or sympathizers with Christian nationalism, right? Based on the PRRI scale. When you add in white mainline Protestants and white Catholics, it looks pretty different. Only 7% of white mainline Protestants and only 8% of white Catholics came out as adherents. And we can talk about this more next week or in the Q&A. I actually think that this PRRI Brookings survey is not accurately counting Catholics, because they are that last question, the one about Christians taking dominion over all parts of society, that comes from something called dominion theology, which is really a Protestant theology. You don't find dominion theology, at least I've never seen it, among Catholics. And so I think that question skews Protestant. And so I think that the Catholic numbers are actually coming in a little low on the survey, and I've told PRRI that. But but approximately 1/3, right? If you add those together, 8 and 22 is about 30% of white Catholics, 33% of white mainline Protestants are coming out as adherents or sympathizers. So about double among white evangelicals compared to white mainline Protestants and white Catholics. Now, when we think about communities of color, Christians of color, PRRI does not, they use certain categories that are fixed across their different surveys. And so they count white evangelicals. They actually don't count evangelicals who are not white at PRRI. So they're not counting Latino evangelicals. Instead they break people into Hispanic or Latino Protestants, Black Protestants, and other Protestants of color. Okay, so what they find is other Protestants of color come out at 20% adherents, 32% sympathizers. So over 50% of this other Protestants of color category come out as either adherents or sympathizers. Hispanic Protestants in this 2022 survey came out 20% adherents, 23% sympathizers. Black Protestants were lower, 14% adherents, 24% sympathizers, and Hispanic Catholics at 6% adherents, 17% sympathizers. Right. So again, big drop off in the kind of Catholic category. Again, I think that dominion theology question might be skewing the numbers a little bit. So according to this survey, all three categories of Protestants of color are more likely to adhere to or sympathize with Christian nationalism than are white mainline Protestants or white Catholics. Right? Pause for a minute and just think about that. Right? All three categories of Protestants of color are more likely to agree on some level with those statements than are white mainline Protestants or white Catholics. So should we call it white Christian nationalism? Should we call it white evangelical Christian nationalism? Now, those are just percentages, right? Those are percentages of the sample that answered this. So I want to think about the real numbers. How many Christian nationalists are white in America, again, according to this survey, versus people of color? So this chart that we saw a little bit before, this is the religious landscape chart that PRRI does. So this is a bigger population of all Americans, and they're breaking it down again by the same categories. And so you're getting a sample of all Americans, and I'm gonna for the sake of our study strip out all the non-Christians from that population. Okay, so we're just going to look at the Christian population of the United States. So we're looking at the blue and green, which according to PRRI, that's 67% of all Americans are Christians. Other surveys find more like 62, 63%. Maybe it's margin of error. Maybe they're asking the question slightly differently. But according to this survey, 67% of all Americans are Christians, and that's the blue and the green. So we're going to combine those. And we'll take out the unaffiliated and people of other religions. So we're just focused on Christian nationalism among American Christians. And according to the way, if you correlate these two surveys that PRRI did, here's the breakdown of Christians by racial identity and sect. So, and this is all the entire population, not about Christian nationalism, of the population. 42% of Christians in America are white Protestants, 19.2% are white Catholics, 21% are Protestants of color, 16% are Catholics of color, and then you've got this kind of margin of other Christians that is mostly made up of Orthodox and LDS, and PRRI doesn't break that down by race. So I'm going to just leave it ambiguous. Christianity in the US is approximately 60% white and 37% people of color. Okay, so people of color are 25% of the US population, 37% of Christians. Again, as I said, that other category is a little bit of a surd in the system. So this is adherence to Christian nationalism in the entire Christian population of the US. So white Protestants make up 53%, or almost 54% of the Christian nationalist adherents. White Catholics make up 11%. Protestants of color make up 25%, and Catholics of color make up 8.3%. So in other words, Christian nationalist adherence among US Christians is approximately 64% white and 33% people of color. So in the entire Christian population, white people are 60% of the Christians, and they're 64% of the Christian nationalist adherents, according to PRRI. What about sympathizers? Again, we have the same chart, same breakdown of Christians. For sympathizers to Christian nationalism, they come out 48.6% white Protestant, 16.1% white Catholic, 20% Protestants of color, and 10% Catholics of color. Those are sympathizers. Again, people who at least indicated some over kind of they're north of the 50% mark on the Christian nationalism scale. And so Christian nationalist sympathy, right? People who are sympathetic in the US is 65% white compared to 60% white in the overall population, and 31% people of color. So in both these surveys, yes, there's a premium in white racial identity for Christian nationalism, but it's not an extreme premium, right? 60% versus 64, 60% versus 65. There is something going on with race and whiteness here. but it's not everything, right? You still have a sizable portion of Christian nationalists, according to this PRRI survey, that are coming out among people of color. Now, I say this as a white Protestant myself, but if I went to a church that was 65% white and 31% people of color, I would not call that a white church. That's pretty close to the breakdown of Christians in America. If I heard about a Christian college that was 65% white and 31% people of color at a Christian college, I call that a success story of integration. Because Christian colleges, and I know this because I have family members who've been to Christian colleges, they tend to be very white, right? But here, among Christian nationalists, adherents, and sympathizers, you see a very sizable portion of people of color, Christians of color, who are identifying with these same ideas, these same statements, same exact survey. So let me talk about some conclusions here. White Christians in the US overall show mildly elevated rates of Christian nationalism adherence and sympathy, right? 64% and 65%, compared to their 60% share of the Christian population. Christians of color in the US overall show mildly lower rates of Christian nationalism adherence, 33%, and sympathy, 31%, compared to their 37% share of the Christian population. But it is quite clear demographically that there's something more than simple white Christian nationalism going on in this survey. It would be one thing if it was 90% white, and you could kind of look at that other 10% and say, it's a rounding error. It's margins. But around a third of Christian nationalists, adherents, and sympathizers are people of color in the survey. So what are we supposed to call it? Is this white Christian nationalism, or is this just Christian nationalism? Or is it something else entirely? Are we getting confused in our own way of understanding and thinking? So, on the one hand, again, just to summarize the quandary, race and white racism are inextricable from American Christian history, and clearly there is a racial dimension at play in American Christian nationalism. I would say those are undeniable. On the other hand, if we simply call it white Christian nationalism, we risk mislabeling and misunderstanding roughly 1/3 of the people involved. In fact, today, literally today, PRRI updated these numbers. And if you recall, Hispanic Protestants in their 2023 numbers, the numbers they released a year ago, were at 40, I think it was 43%, either adherents or sympathizers with Christian nationalism, right? That was a year ago when they released this survey. The numbers they released today, Hispanic Protestants were at 55% adherents or sympathizers. They had gone up 12% in 1 year. What is going on? How is that happening? If what we're talking about is white Christian nationalism, why is it expanding, especially among Latino Protestants? So I think, and this is where I'm going to give you my theory, and you are welcome to disagree with my theory. You're welcome to ask questions of my theory. The problem is that both sides are acting as though Christian nationalism is one clear and undifferentiated phenomenon, and that we need to have one label for everything. And I think that is just incorrect. I think that's the wrong way of approaching this. As I said, we need to think about our taxonomy of Christian nationalism, right? If you remember, again, back in your biology class, like kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? We move from broader categories into more narrow categories, from more generic terms into more specific terms. And so if we're only using a vocabulary of white Christian nationalism, well, how do we think about Christian nationalism in Ghana? Right? Is that just downstream of white American conceptions of things, or is that a different phenomenon? How do we think about Christian nationalism in Brazil? That was very, very influential in the Capitol riot that occurred in Brasilia just about a year ago in January of 2023. Similar to our Capitol riot in the US, there were people carrying their Bibles. There were people singing Christian worship songs. There were people praying. There were people prophesying at the Capitol riot in Brasilia. And yes, there is a category of whiteness in Brazil, but it's a very different conception of whiteness. There's a very different racial dynamic in Brazil from what we have in the US. So is that white Christian nationalism? Or do we need to think in slightly different terms here? So here's what I'd like to offer. Here's my way of approaching this question. And again, I'm eager for your questions and your concerns. So there is, if we're starting in this taxonomy system, I'm going to start at the level of order because it just gets confusing if you go too much higher. I think in the order, we're talking about religious nationalisms. That's the category that we're working with. And I talked about this a little bit last week, that you have, there are many different forms of religious nationalism, right? There's a lot of different religious nationalisms that are operative in the world, right? And it's this way that we have, especially in the modern world, of blending political and partisan or clannish identities with our religious identities, right? That there are connections between these things. That is the way that Christian nationalism or religious nationalism or Hindu nationalism gets kind of organized and created. And the family that we're talking about would be Christian nationalisms, forms of Christian nationalism. And these would be a parallel to forms of Hindu nationalism or Islamic nationalism, what is often called Islamism, right? So the family of things that we're thinking about now are Christian nationalisms. But those Christian nationalisms are going to look very, very different in different geographical and cultural spaces, right? We're thinking at a global scale right now. So there's different types of Christian nationalism. You could talk about, yes, American Christian nationalism is a type of Christian nationalism, but you also have Hungarian Christian nationalism and Ghanaian Christian nationalism and Brazilian Christian nationalism. And so when we get to the level of a genus, right, just above the level of species, here, when we're having the American conversation, we are talking about American Christian nationalisms, which have their own flavor that we looked at last week, right? You're not going to find people in Ghana necessarily saying Ghana is the new Israel. That's a very American formulation of Christian nationalism that emerges out of particularities in American history. Or thinking about great awakenings as a manifestation of American religion. Well, that's different than what we find in other cultures and other societies, right? Or thinking about this Judeo-Christian as a way of framing identity. Yes, there's other places that blend or appropriate Judaism. There's Christians all over the world who appropriate Judaism. But that phrase, Judeo-Christian, emerges in this American context, or at least is utilized in this American context as a stand-in for other ways of talking about American Christianity, right? So there are particularities to our American style of Christian nationalisms that manifest in the different ways that Christian nationalism manifests in America. But those are still uniquely American and are not necessarily importable or exportable to other parts of the world. So finally, when we get to the level of species, I think we can talk about a species of white Christian nationalism. I think it's a real thing. I don't think the survey data are lying. I think that the studies that we have are accurately capturing that there is an interplay between white racial identity and Christian nationalism. But I'm just saying that's not the only form or the only style or the only species of Christian nationalism in the United States. I would say that white Christian nationalism in the United States is deeply rooted in Protestantism. And so there are other forms of Catholic Christian nationalism. In fact, I would say there are probably multiple forms of Catholic Christian nationalism from conversations I've had with Catholic colleagues, but that manifests differently than this kind of predominantly white Protestant style. In fact, I would say that species of white Christian nationalism is more predominant regionally in the South and Midwest, which is what we saw in those maps. Where white Christianity is more dominant, I would say there is more white Christian nationalism. We also have, and we'll get into this more next week, we have more theological forms of Christian nationalism, like what was talked about as Reformed or Calvinist Reconstructionist Christian nationalism. A lot of the people who are writing books today that are affirmatively saying, I'm a Christian nationalist, are coming out of a particular Calvinist strand of theology that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s called the Reconstructionist movement. That's a very different thing, right? Because it's rooted in a particular interpretation of Protestant theology that sometimes is racialized and sometimes isn't, right? And I would argue that that's actually a different form that overlaps sometimes maybe, or cross-pollinates with this white Christian nationalism, but isn't always the same. And next week, we'll be looking at actually a very multi-ethnic form of American Christian nationalism. We could call it the independent charismatic style of Christian nationalism. We'll look at that next week. So again, what I'm trying to offer here is maybe a middle path or an alternative path to say, I think white Christian nationalism is real. But I think if we limit our vocabulary to that, we only call the issue that we're looking at white Christian nationalism, we're misdiagnosing and misunderstanding a lot of what is happening in Christian nationalism in the United States. We always need to pay attention to race, absolutely. And white racism and the history of especially Anglo-Protestant Christianity has given shape to the conversation that we have today. But Christian nationalism in the United States has been diversified, just like the rest of American society. And if we only talk about white Christian nationalism, then I worry that we're missing out on a part of the picture that is actually very, very important. So if you have questions, please put them in the Slido. It looks like we'll have a few minutes to talk about them. Let me offer a few conclusions, and then we'll try to have some time for questions and Q&A before we wrap up in about 15 minutes. To reiterate, I think we should never analyze or understand religion as detached from race in the United States. In other cultural spaces, in other national histories, I think that's an arguable proposition. But in the United States, based on our history, based on the way that Anglo-Protestantism gave shape to forms of prejudice, both religious prejudice and racial prejudice in the United States, I don't think you can ever detach those two things. You always need to have race in the conversation when you're analyzing and thinking about Christianity, especially in the United States. And this plays out also within Islam, within Judaism, right? Race is also layered into all of our religious traditions in very complicated and messy ways. But at least when we're talking about Christian nationalism, I think we need to keep race in the picture. But I think it would be equally simplistic to say that white Christianity equals bad and anti-democratic, and non-white Christianity equals good and pro-social. Because that race-religion interface in the US is complicated and regionalized and layered. And not everyone relates to race or to religion in the same way. Right? There are many Christians in the United States who downplay their own racial or ethnic identity in favor of their religious identity. And there are many people in the United States who prefer to emphasize their racial or ethnic identity over their religious identity. And we need ways of analyzing that are sensitive to those variations, to that complexity. As I said, Christian nationalism in the United States itself has become diversified. I think that is objectively there in the data. I know people who are sociologists who are working on academic papers that basically show that same thing, that this is way more diverse. Even the PRRI data that they just put out showed that, especially among Hispanic Protestants, there's been a surge of Christian nationalism in the last few years. What does that say about our politics? What does that say about the 2024 election, if you think about it, right? Yes, white Christian nationalism is a real force in American politics, undeniable. But if we only pay attention to white Christian nationalism, then I worry that we risk not seeing the subterranean spread of these ideas into communities of Christians of color who are a pivotal voice in our society. And I also worry that oftentimes, and I say this as a Californian transplant on the East Coast, often in the American conversation, especially the one that happens on the East Coast, everything is framed in terms of black and white. And that's understandable from our history, but there are very wide swaths of our country where race does not simply happen in a black and white conversation. I think we need to pay attention to those spaces as well and understand that. In fact, I would say, according to survey data and according to my intensive research in these areas, that Black Christian communities have been outposts of resistance to this kind of Republican and Trumpy style of Christian nationalism. But that's not as true among Latino and Latina communities. That's not as true among Asian American communities. And especially when you have race, again, is very complicated. The multiracial dimension that is often missed in our surveys actually plays a very big role in the way that Christian nationalism manifests on the ground. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to switch over and try to pull up our Q&A here, be able to try to address as many questions as I can. Okay, let me see here. David Gushee, excellent scholar and Christian ethicist, uses the phrase authoritarian reactionary Christianity rather than white Christian nationalism. Does that resonate with me? I think that's actually a very useful category. And again, David Gushee, if you don't, or if you should buy his book. But if you're interested in getting the gist of his book, he did an excellent interview on the Politicology podcast. It was a two-part. I think it aired in February, within the last month or so. Just search for the Politicology podcast, David Gushee. And it was basically like an hour and a half total interview where he really laid a lot of this out. But he's thinking on a global scale. So he's not merely thinking about the US, and he's looking at global trends into this more authoritarian style, this reactionary and authoritarian style of Christianity, and the way that it is in some ways a transnational phenomenon. I think that is very, very helpful. It's not necessarily the terminology that I've adopted, but I think that that's very important. And David Gushee, as a Christian ethicist, is actually doing really excellent work on combating and challenging the narratives of Christian nationalism from the perspective as a Christian. So highly recommend his work. I think it's really useful. Question: what is appealing about Christian nationalism to people of color? I want to work on that some next week, but I'll try to offer, if I have an answer or some answer. In the independent charismatic sector, which I would argue is really, and we'll look at this next week, the insurgent style of Christian nationalism. It's a very multi-ethnic arena of American society, and there are a lot of leadership opportunities for people of color in those spaces, in multi-ethnic communities. And there's very intentional empowerment, even by white leaders, of people of color. There's also racism in that system, but it's the complicated sort of racism that is that you find in multi-ethnic spaces, more spaces like California, where I grew up, or spaces like Arizona, really the entire West Coast. It's a racism that instrumentalizes people of color. And we'll talk more about that next week and look at some examples of that. But Cheon, who I mentioned, this Korean American pastor and apostle in the independent charismatic world, I don't think he's a white Christian nationalist. I think he's a Christian supremacist, and I'll make that delineation and distinction next week. But I think there's the other side of this, especially when we talk about Latino and Latina communities, is that some of the networks of Christian supremacy that exist are transnational networks that bridge between the United States and Latin America. Let me give you one example. When Donald Trump launched his Evangelicals for Trump 2020 campaign, which was in some ways kind of the Christian evangelical adjunct to the 2020 campaign. It was an outreach effort directed particularly at evangelicals. He did it at the church of one of his major evangelical advisors, a man named Guillermo Maldonado. And Guillermo Maldonado leads a massive megachurch, bilingual megachurch in Miami called El Rey Jesus, the King Jesus. And so the Evangelicals for Trump 2020 launch event was at this huge, I think it's about 15,000 people, bilingual church. They have services in Spanish and in English, led by Apostle Guillermo Maldonado. And Guillermo Maldonado has a network of churches throughout Latin America that look to him as their apostle. It's about 500 churches, mostly, again, not in the US, but in Latin America, South and Central America. And so for Guillermo Maldonado, he has access to power through Trump. And he did not, this was not a secretive event. People from the church were there. They were participating in this. And were seeing themselves in some ways enlisted in the American story. Right? That there's a way that Christian nationalism offers a narrative of potential inclusion for Christians of color. You can join the structures of power, not through race, but through religion. And that's very appealing to a lot of people, I think. But again, we'll think more about that a little next week. What are the intersections between gender and sexual identity, race and Christian nationalism? Again, that could be a 3-week course unto itself. There are many. So if you read some of these sociology books by Sam Perry, Phil Gorski, Andrew Whitehead, there definitely is a lot of, there's a lot of gender that gets layered into all of this stuff. Christian nationalists tend to be more patriarchal in their orientation to gender, more about male authority and male headship would be kind of the more Christian theological term. And that's been very, very important to the ways that Christian nationalism manifests. But again, I think we need to differentiate between the different kinds of Christian nationalism, because independent charismatic Christian nationalism is largely what we call theologically egalitarian, which means women can serve in any role in leadership in the community. Women can be pastors, women can be evangelists, women can be prophets, women can be apostles, women can be televangelists, right? And so there's a variability between these different styles. The Reformed Reconstructionist tends to be very patriarchal. In fact, I was watching a video of a Reformed Reconstructionist the other day advocating for Christian nationalism and saying, not only should women not be in leadership in the church, but men and Christians should not vote for women to hold any office, because the Bible talks about male authority. Right? That is a very outlier position, even within evangelicalism. But it's coming out of his theological universe, which is driving the way that he not only approaches religion, but also the politics itself and the gendered politics. Somebody asked the question, how do we get people to pay attention to this story? And that's part of why I'm trying to offer this alternative taxonomy. I think if we imagine Christian nationalism as a movement with a coherent structure and a coherent ideology and a set of shared beliefs and priorities, then we tend to want to impose a single label on it. I think of Christian nationalism not as a movement, but as a tendency in American history. It's an inclination. In some ways, especially today, it's a sentiment. Many people who are answering these questions positively and saying, oh yeah, I agree with that. I think for them, it's a sentimental attachment to a vision of a Christian America that they think existed once upon a time. Now, query whether that ever actually existed, whether it ever was idealized the way that they think about it, I'm severely doubtful. But there's a nostalgia for a Christianity of a Christian America of the 1950s, right? That the Protestant Catholic Jew kind of Judeo-Christian America. They're the people who like to sing God Bless America. The people who like to sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Have they fully thought through the relationship between church and state? Do they have a clear position on whether the Ten Commandments should be in courthouses? No, they're kind of going off of intuition. But there are real movements of what I call Christian supremacy that are organized, that are theological, that are programmatic, that have clear policy agendas. And so I think we maybe need to think not only in terms of like, oh, there's different types, but there's even a spectrum of, and this is what you see there, right? There's the adherents versus the sympathizers. I think some of the sympathizers of Christian nationalism are winnable into pluralism. Pew did a really interesting survey in the fall of 22, around the same time as this the PRRI survey was being conducted. And they asked some of these same questions. Do you think that America should be a Christian nation? It was like 45% of Americans said yes to that question. But then Pew did follow-up questions. Okay, you think that America should be a Christian nation? Well, do you think the Supreme Court should use the Bible to determine its decisions about law? Oh, no. So do you think the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation? No. Do you think that people who are not Christians should have fewer rights than Christians have? No. So what they found was, yeah, 45% of people said, yes, the US should be a Christian nation. But only about 10 to 15% said the Supreme Court should integrate the Bible into its decision-making, or the federal government should declare the US a Christian nation. That is the differentiation I'm making between Christian supremacy and Christian nationalism. The more hardline adherence side of the spectrum versus this kind of vague sympathizers side. Okay. What happened to Hispanic Catholics in the latest result? I'd have to go look that up. But again, this new PRRI data, it just published today. You can go on the PRRI website, compare the two reports. I would encourage you to do that. I have probably spent more time than I should on that. Yes. Okay, so somebody asked, is Martin Luther King a Christian nationalist? And I would say, according to some definitions, yes, he is. But again, if we are talking, so I mean, if you look at the rhetoric of Martin Luther King, he frequently was talking about calling the United States back to its Christian roots as a path to justice and inclusion. And some of our definitions of Christian nationalism are so vague that they would say, well, that you're not separating church and state, you're not separating religious and secular, or religious and national identities. So that's Christian nationalism. I would say that is not Christian nationalism the way that we talk about Christian nationalism today. And I think part of the problem with even just looking only at surveys is that you get a very comprehensive but thin picture. And I would say that the next generation of scholarship on Christian nationalism needs to go deep into these different styles of Christian nationalism and get into the real identities that are underneath these different manifestations of Christian nationalism. Because some of those manifestations of Christian nationalism, I think, are grave threats to our democracy. And some of them are people singing God Bless America, which is not a threat to our democracy as far as I can tell. Right? And I think we need to get more sophisticated in how we talk about this. Okay. I'm going to wrap us there. We're a couple minutes over. Thank you all for joining. Again, you'll get the link to the video of this if you want to go back and watch it or share it with friends. And we will be back together next week. Thank you all.